A loner cowboy saved a dying native girl, not knowing she taught him how to love again. Jack was a cowboy, but he wasn't the kind of cowboy you saw in the movies. He didn't wear a flashy hat or ride into town with a smile on his face. In fact, Jack was the opposite of what most people imagined when they thought of a cowboy. He lived alone, far away from others, in a small cabin tucked between tall pines and rocky hills. The silence of the wilderness was his only company, and he had grown to love it. His life had been shaped by loss, and he preferred the solitude that came with it. For years, Jack had lived this way, never needing anyone. His horses, his rifle, and his dog were all he needed. He had no desire to get involved with people, especially not with a woman. His past had taught him the hard way, that people could leave just as easily as they came. One day, while riding out for supplies, Jack came across something unexpected. His horse's hooves crunched through the snow as he made his way down a narrow trail. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the snow-covered ground. It was a peaceful evening, and Jack expected the usual quiet, but then he saw her. At first, he thought she was just another lost traveler. But as he drew closer, he realized the girl wasn't just lost. She was in trouble. She was lying in the snow, barely moving, her clothes torn and stained with blood. Her long black hair was matted against her forehead, and her breathing was shallow. Jack's heart raced. He pulled his horse to a stop, not sure what to do. He couldn't leave her there. Something inside him, something he couldn't explain, told him to help.
Without hesitation, he slid off his horse and knelt beside her.
The girl's eyes fluttered open for a moment, and she gasped for air. Her lips were cracked, and her face was pale, but she managed to whisper, "Please."
"Dick, help me!" Jack didn't know who she was, but he could tell she wasn't from around here. Her skin was darker than any of the local settlers, and her clothes were unfamiliar.
The way she spoke sounded different, too, but none of that mattered now. Jack could see she was dying. Without a second thought, he scooped her up in his arms and placed her on his horse. He didn't care where she came from or who she was. She needed help, and he was the only one around to give it. The ride back to his cabin felt like it took forever. The girl was barely conscious, her body limp against him. Jack kept glancing down at her, making sure she didn't slip away. The weight of her head on his shoulder made him feel something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of responsibility. When they finally reached the cabin, Jack gently laid her on the bed, trying not to disturb her too much. He quickly started a fire in the stove, his hands moving with practiced ease as he prepared the space. But his mind was racing. What had happened to her? Where did she come from? Why was she all alone out here? Jack didn't have many supplies, but he did what he could. He used clean cloths to tend to her wounds, carefully cleaning the cuts and bruises that marred her skin. She had been hurt badly, he could tell that much. But there was something about her calmness that made Jack think she had been through more than just the physical pain. There was a deeper hurt in her eyes, a sadness that Jack couldn't quite place. As night settled in, Jack sat by the fire, watching over her. His mind wandered to his own past, his own losses. He had spent years hiding from the world, shutting people out because it was easier that way. But here he was, caring for someone he didn't even know. It wasn't like him. And yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he was doing the right thing. Hours passed, and the girl's breathing steadied. Jack could tell she was still alive, but he knew she wasn't out of danger yet. He stayed by her side, his eyes fixed on her, even though he was exhausted. The fire crackled softly in the background, the only sound in the quiet cabin. Around midnight, the girl stirred. G moaned softly and opened her eyes, blinking as if she was trying to make sense of her surroundings. When she saw Jack, her lips parted in a weak attempt to speak, but no words came out. Jack leaned in closer. Don't try to talk. You're safe now. Her eyes locked onto his, and for a brief moment they just stared at each other. Jack didn't know what to make of it, but there was something in the girl's gaze, a silent plea, maybe, or an unspoken thanks. Jack wasn't sure, but he nodded slightly, as if to say that he understood. The girl closed her eyes again and drifted back into a restless sleep. Jack sat back in the chair beside the bed, his mind still racing. What was her story? Who had done this to her? And why was she out here alone? The wind howled outside, shaking the small cabin. The storm was only getting worse. Jack had never been a man of many words, but that night he spoke to her anyway. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the isolation of the cabin, or maybe it was the quiet understanding between them. But he felt the need to say something. "I've been alone for a long time," he said softly, his voice barely a whisper. "Too long, probably. It's easier to shut people out than to let them in.
But maybe that's not the right way to live."
He sighed, rubbing his hand over his face. "I don't know what happened to you, but I'm here."
"I'm not going anywhere." The girl didn't respond. She didn't need to. The silence between them was enough. It was a strange, unspoken connection. Two lost souls, both scarred by the past, but somehow finding something in each other. Jack wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he wasn't as alone as he thought. As the night wore on, Jack kept watch over her, a steady presence in the quiet of the cabin. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but something inside him told him he couldn't walk away from this. Not now. The girl was alive, and she had a second chance. And maybe, just maybe, Jack had one, too. The following days passed slowly, each one blending into the next. Jack kept to his routine, as he always did, but now there was something different about it. The quiet cabin, once just a place of solitude for him, felt warmer with another person inside. Ayanna, the girl he had found in the snow, remained unconscious for most of that first week. Jack didn't mind the silence, though. He wasn't the talkative type, and neither was she. Yet, in the stillness, something shifted. He would wake up early just as the sun began to rise and make sure the fire was still burning. The cabin was small, and the warmth of the stove was always welcome. But then, he'd check on Ayanna. She still looked fragile, her skin pale and thin. But there was life in her now. He could see it in the way her chest rose and fell steadily. At first, Jack thought he'd have to bury her out there in the woods, but now he saw a glimmer of hope in her. It wasn't just her body that needed healing, though, Burrow. Jack could tell that she carried something heavier than physical pain, something deeper, something unspoken. She had been through a lot, far more than he could guess. Every time he looked at her, he saw the shadows in her eyes, even when she was asleep. But for now, all he could do was care for her and wait for her to wake up. Jack didn't expect her to wake up quickly. He wasn't one to rush things. He gave her time to rest, time to recover. Even though he felt a strange urgency building within him. He was a man of action, someone who fixed problems with his hands. But this was different. This wasn't a wound he could stitch up with needle and thread. It was something far more complicated, something that needed patience. The first time Ayanna opened her eyes, it was the middle of the afternoon. Jack was tending to the stove when he heard her stir. He glanced over to see her shifting in the bed, Her brow furrowed slightly. It was a slow, gradual movement, as though she was trying to make sense of where she was. Her lips parted, and she let out a soft, almost inaudible groan.
"Easy there," Jack said, his voice gruff but gentle.
He had no idea how to comfort someone, especially a stranger. But something about the way she looked at him, wide eyes filled with confusion and fear, made him feel the need to offer her some reassurance. "You're safe now. You're okay." Ayana's eyes didn't leave him. For a moment there was only silence between them, but it wasn't the same silence that had filled the cabin before. It was different now. She wasn't just a stranger anymore. She was a person Jack had saved, and somehow she had become important to him. Ayana's lips trembled slightly as she tried to speak, but only a soft whisper came out. "Who are you?" Jack hesitated. He wasn't used to being asked personal questions, especially by someone he had just met. Breath. He was a man who preferred to keep to himself, and his past had taught him that people didn't need to know the details of his life. But for some reason the question felt different this time.
"It felt like something more. My name's Jack," he replied simply, his voice still rough from years of disuse.
"I found you out in the snow. Brought you here to my cabin." She blinked as if processing the words. She looked around the small cabin, her eyes settling on the simple furnishings. Nothing fancy, just the basics. The fire crackled softly in the stove, and the wind howled outside. The storm was still going strong, but inside it felt safe, calm. I don't remember," she whispered. Her voice was weak, and Jack could tell she was still struggling to keep her eyes open. She had been through so much, and yet all she could do was stare at him, her face unreadable. "That's okay," Jack said, his voice steady. "You don't need to remember right now. Just rest. That's all you need to do." Ayana nodded slowly, her eyes closing again as she sank back into the bed. Jack watched her for a moment before returning to the stove. He didn't know what to say next. He didn't know how to make her feel better. But he did know one thing. He couldn't leave her alone. Not now. Not when she was still so fragile. The days that followed were a blur of routine. Jack kept the fire going, made sure there was enough food to eat, and took care of the chores around the cabin. All the while, Ayana remained in her bed healing. She would occasionally open her eyes, but most of the time, she slept. Jack didn't mind. He was used to being alone, and this silence felt comfortable to him. He found a strange sense of peace in it. But the peace wasn't always quiet. Every now and then, Jack would catch Ayana staring at him from across the room, her gaze intense, as though she was trying to understand him. Jack wasn't sure what to make of it, but he could feel the weight of her stare. It made him uncomfortable, but at the same time, it drew him in. There was something in her eyes, something that made him feel like she could see right through him, into the heart of who he really was. One evening after supper, Jack was cleaning up when Ayana spoke again, her voice quiet and uncertain. "Why did you help me?" she asked, her words soft but full of curiosity. "I don't know you." Jack paused, his hand stilling in midair as he dried a plate. The question caught him off guard. It wasn't something he had thought about before. Why had he helped her? There were plenty of reasons, he supposed. It was the right thing to do for one. He couldn't just leave her out there to die. But there was more to it than that. Something inside him had pushed him to act. Something deeper than mere duty. "I don't know," Jack muttered, his voice rougher than he meant it to be. "Maybe I just couldn't leave you out there."
It wasn't right.
Ayana's eyes softened as she listened to him. She didn't say anything more, but Jack could feel the weight of her gaze, and for the first time he felt like he might actually be seen.
Not as the silent cowboy who kept to himself, but as something more, something human. The next few days passed without much change. Jack continued to take care of Ayana, and she slowly regained strength. The fever had broken, and her wounds had started to heal. But there was still a distance between them, a silence that neither of them knew how to bridge. At night, as Jack lay in bed, he found himself thinking about her more and more. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected to care. But Ayana was different. She wasn't like anyone he'd ever met. Her strength, even in silence, amazed him. It wasn't just the way she had survived her injuries. It was something deeper, something he couldn't quite place.
He didn't know what the future held.
He didn't know what would happen when she was fully healed and could leave. But for now, Jack was content to just let her rest, let her heal, and maybe, just maybe, find a way to let himself heal, too. As the days went on, the winter storm outside began to lose its grip on the land. The snow, which had piled up around the cabin in thick layers, started to melt away, revealing patches of brown earth. The sun was warmer, the air fresher, and there was a hint of spring in the wind. But inside the cabin, the season wasn't the only thing changing. Jack and Ayana were both feeling the shift.
Jack noticed it first.
It wasn't anything dramatic at first, just little things.
He began to notice the way Ayana would watch him when he wasn't looking, the way her gaze lingered for a second too long before she quickly looked away. She was quiet, too quiet sometimes, and Jack couldn't help but wonder what was going on in her mind. Breath. She hadn't said much since that night she had first opened her eyes, but Jack could feel a change in the air. It wasn't just the weather that was shifting. Something was changing between them. He hadn't planned on getting close to her. Not really. He was the kind of man who kept his distance from people, especially women. Brace. They brought complications he didn't want. He didn't need anyone to depend on, and he certainly didn't want to need anyone either. But there was something about Ayana, the way she looked at him, the quiet strength she carried even when she was still healing. It all stirred something in Jack that he hadn't felt in years. Maybe it was loneliness, or maybe it was something deeper. Whatever it was, it unsettled him. It was hard to deny that somewhere along the way he had stopped seeing her as just the girl he had found in the snow. She was more than that now. She had become something. Someone he couldn't easily ignore. Jack didn't know how to deal with it, though. He'd spent so long keeping his heart locked up, and now here she was, slowly finding her way inside. The nights were the hardest, when the fire would crackle softly and the wind howled outside. Jack would find himself lying awake, staring at the ceiling. He wasn't used to sharing space with someone, especially not someone like Ayana. She was quiet, still recovering, but there was a restlessness about her that seemed to match his own. He knew she had seen things that Jack couldn't even begin to imagine. But he also saw the way she started to open up little by little, the way her guarded expression would soften when they spoke. But she wasn't one to share her thoughts or feelings easily. But Jack could see the struggle in her eyes. There were moments when she seemed to want to say something, and then she'd hold back. She wasn't like him. She hadn't learned to keep everything inside, to carry the weight of the world in silence. She was more open, but only to a point. Jack respected that, though he didn't quite understand it. For the first time in a long time, Jack found himself trying to understand someone. Something he had never really cared to do before. One evening after dinner, Jack was sitting by the fire sharpening a knife. Ayana was sitting across from him, staring into the flames. But she hadn't spoken much since dinner, and Jack didn't press her. He had learned to respect her silence, just as she had respected his. But tonight, there was something different. He could feel it. "You don't talk much," Jack said, breaking the silence. He wasn't sure why he said it. Maybe it was the way her stillness filled the room, making it heavier than usual.
Ayana's eyes flickered to him, and for the first time in a long while she smiled. Just a small, fleeting smile, but it was there.
"I don't have much to say," she replied softly. Jack didn't know how to respond. He wasn't good at conversations. He had always preferred action over words. But something about her quietness made him want to try, to bridge the gap between them in a way that wasn't through the usual silences. I used to think that too.
Break collars! Aye, thought I didn't need anyone. But it's different now, I guess.
Ayana didn't answer right away. She just sat there, looking at him, as if she were weighing his words. Jack couldn't help but wonder what was going through her mind. What did she think of him? Was she just as unsure about all this as he was?
"You saved my life," she said after a long pause.
Her voice was quiet, but there was a certain strength in it. "I don't know why, but you did." Jack shifted uncomfortably in his seat, breath. He wasn't used to being thanked, especially not like this. "I couldn't just leave you out there." Despair. "It wasn't the right thing to do," he muttered. Ayana nodded slowly, as if she understood what he meant. "And now what?" Jack wasn't sure what she meant by that. "What do you mean?" She looked down at her hands, fidgeting with the edges of her blanket. Inspiration. "You helped me. But now what? What happens next?" Jack didn't have an answer. He had been so focused on getting through the days, on getting her to a point where she could stand on her own again, that he hadn't thought much about what would happen after that. He wasn't sure what to say. The future had never seemed important to him. The present was all that mattered. But now, with Ayana in the cabin, it felt like there was something more he needed to think about. "I don't know," Jack admitted. "I guess we take it one day at a time."
Ayana looked at him for a long moment.
She seemed to be searching for something in his face, as if trying to figure him out. Jack could feel her gaze on him, but he didn't look away. He didn't want to. It was strange, this pull he felt toward her. He had spent so long hiding from the world, and now, with her here, he couldn't help but feel something inside him stir. She wasn't like anyone he had known before. There was a quietness about her that matched his own, but there was something else there too, a vulnerability, a strength, an openness that made her different. It wasn't something Jack could put into words, but he felt it. He felt it every time she looked at him, every time their hands brushed, every time she said something small but meaningful.
Days passed, and the more time Jack spent with Ayana, the more he realized how much she had already changed him.
He couldn't deny it anymore. The walls he had built around himself were crumbling, slowly but surely. And every time Ayana smiled, every time she spoke to him, the pieces of his heart he had kept hidden for so long started to fall into place.
Ayana was teaching him how to feel again.
It wasn't easy, and it wasn't something Jack could rush. But it was happening, little by little, and with each passing day he found himself hoping for something more. More than the quiet life he had built. More than the loneliness that had once felt like a friend. With Ayana, for the first time in a long time, Jack found something he never thought he'd have again. Hope. But he was afraid of what it meant to open up to someone, to let them see the parts of him he had buried so deeply. Basie. Ayana wasn't just healing from her wounds, she was helping him heal from his own. And That scared him more than anything. The spring days grew warmer, and with each passing week, the snow slowly melted away. The land around Jack's cabin began to awaken from the long winter, with small green shoots peeking up through the ground and birds returning to the trees.
Dasketekin. Inside the cabin, things were changing, too, though in ways Jack wasn't always sure he could explain. Jack had been living in silence for so long he had almost forgotten how to speak from the heart.
It wasn't that he didn't care. He did. But Jack had built walls around himself over the years, convinced that they were the only way to survive. Breath. He had kept people out, avoided deep connections, because every time he let someone close, he lost them. It was easier to be alone. But Ayanna had come into his life like a storm, shaking everything up. Her quiet presence was a reminder that life wasn't meant to be lived in isolation.
She hadn't asked for anything from him, but somehow she had become everything he didn't know he needed.
She had seen through his walls, even when he tried to keep her out. And now, the silence between them wasn't the same as before. It was heavy with something neither of them could ignore anymore. Jack watched her more often now, noticing how she carried herself with a grace he hadn't seen in anyone before. She moved with a kind of quiet dignity, the weight of her past still lingering in her eyes. But there was a calmness in her that made everything around her feel more peaceful. The way she helped around the cabin, even in small ways, made Jack realize how much he had come to rely on her presence, even if he hadn't admitted it to himself yet. The tension between them grew slowly, as if it were always there, hidden just beneath the surface. It was in the way they would catch each other's eyes across the room, in the way their hands brushed when they reached for the same thing. Every touch, no matter how brief, felt like a spark, an unspoken connection that neither of them knew how to handle. But it wasn't just the physical closeness. It was the emotional distance between them that was starting to close. Jack had been holding something back, something deep inside him, that he hadn't been able to face until now. He had been living in fear. Fear of letting someone in. Fear of caring too much because the last time he let himself feel he lost everything. Ayanna, with her quiet strength, had chipped away at that fear. And now Jack was beginning to realize that he couldn't keep hiding from what he felt for her. One evening after dinner, they sat together by the fire. The wind had picked up outside, howling through the trees, but inside the cabin it was warm and still. Ayanna was sitting close to the fire, her legs crossed beneath her, staring into the flames. Jack sat across from her, his boots resting on the wooden floor, his hands clasped together in his lap. The air between them felt thick, as if they were both waiting for something to break the silence, but neither of them knew what to say. Finally, Jack couldn't stand it anymore. The words he had been holding back for so long bubbled to the surface, and before he could stop himself, he found his voice.
"I don't know what I'm doing anymore,"
he said, his voice rough, as if it hadn't been used in years. Breaths.
"I didn't expect any of this."
He gestured between them, though he wasn't sure what he was trying to explain. Ayanna looked up at him, her dark eyes steady and calm. She didn't say anything at first, just watched him, as if she were waiting for him to continue. Jack felt exposed under her gaze, vulnerable in a way he hadn't been in years. It was as if she could see straight through him, into the parts of himself he had buried so deep. "I've spent so long keeping everyone away," Jack continued, his voice quieter now. "I didn't think I could let anyone in, not after everything. But now, with you here, it feels different, and I don't know how to handle it." Ayanna didn't move, but her expression softened. She didn't say anything, but Jack could feel her understanding, as if she could sense what he was struggling to express. She had been through her own pain, her own losses, and Jack realized that maybe she understood more than he had given her credit for. "I'm afraid," Jack admitted, his voice barely above a whisper.
Afraid of letting you get too close. Afraid of what'll happen when this ends.
When you leave.
Ayana's gaze never wavered.
She didn't seem surprised by his words. She had known all along that Jack had been holding something back, but she hadn't pushed him to talk. She had let him come to this point on his own. Now, finally, he had opened up. And somehow, that made everything feel like it was shifting into place. "I'm not going anywhere," Ayana said softly, her voice calm and steady.
"Not unless you want me to." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment there was nothing but the crackling of the fire and the sound of the wind outside. Jack's heart thudded in his chest as he processed what she had said. He hadn't realized until that very moment how much he needed to hear those words.
"Why?" Jack asked, his voice filled with confusion.
"Why stay here with me? I'm not someone worth sticking around for."
"You don't even know me."
Ayana smiled slightly, the corners of her lips lifting just enough to show a soft warmth.
I know enough. I know that you're not the man you think you are.
"I know that you care, even if you don't want to admit it."
Jack stared at her, feeling a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. He couldn't believe how easily she had seen through him. Ayana was different from everyone he had ever known.
But she wasn't scared of his walls, didn't let them stop her from seeing him for who he truly was. She had done the same for herself. She wasn't afraid to let someone in, even when she had every reason to be. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked with hers. "I don't know how to love anyone," he admitted, his voice low, almost lost. "I've spent so many years running from it." "But when you're here, it's hard to keep running."
"I don't want to be alone anymore."
"I don't want to lose you." Ayana didn't speak, but she reached out then, her hand resting on his. The simple touch felt like everything. Jack's heart skipped a beat as he looked at her, seeing the truth in her eyes. The same truth that had been inside him all along. He had spent so long pushing people away, but now with her here, with her hand in his, Jack realized that maybe, just maybe, he was ready to open up. He wasn't afraid of love anymore.
Ayana squeezed his hand gently, her touch grounding him in a way nothing else had.
She didn't need to say anything more. They both knew what had changed. In that quiet moment, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the cold of the world outside, they had crossed a threshold. There was no turning back now. The days that followed felt different. The tension between them had dissolved, replaced by a quiet understanding.
Ayana stayed by his side, not out of obligation, but because she wanted to.
Back. For the first time in years, allowed himself to lean into the connection between them. They weren't just two people living together in a cabin anymore.
They were something more, something real. The storm had passed, both outside and inside the cabin, and for the first time Jack didn't feel like he had to face the world alone. The sun had begun to set, casting a soft orange glow over the land as Jack stepped outside, his boots crunching against the freshly thawed ground. It had been a long winter, and now the world around him was waking up. The trees were starting to bud, the air was fresh, and the earth was slowly coming to life again. He could smell the wet soil and hear the distant calls of birds returning from their migration. Jack hadn't realized just how much he had missed the seasons changing until now. The past few months had been a blur of quiet days, punctuated only by the sound of Ayana's soft voice or the crackling of the fire. He had spent so much time in his own world, isolated and closed off, that he had forgotten what it felt like to be part of something bigger. But with Ayana by his side, everything felt different. She had brought something into his life that he hadn't even known he was missing. Love broke. Not the kind of love he had known before, the kind that left him broken and alone, but a deeper, quieter love that filled the empty spaces in his heart. With her, Jack had learned what it meant to truly care for someone again. He had learned that love wasn't something to be feared. It was something to embrace, even when it felt like the world might fall apart. As Jack walked across the yard, he glanced toward the cabin, where Ayanna was sitting on the porch. She was still recovering, though her strength had returned, and she had become an essential part of the rhythm of their days.
It was no longer just Jack's cabin. It was theirs, a place they had made together.
Ayanna had been through so much, and Jack could see the scars she carried. But there was something in her now, something stronger than before. She had fought to survive, not just physically, but emotionally. She had learned to trust again, and though she hadn't said much about her past, Jack knew enough to understand that it hadn't been easy. Yet she had come to him, not because she needed saving, but because, in some strange way, they needed each other. And in this quiet, peaceful place, surrounded by the wilderness, Jack had found something he hadn't thought he would ever have again, a future. As he approached the porch, Ayanna looked up at him, her dark eyes meeting his with that familiar calmness. She was holding a small bundle of wildflowers, the colors bright and vibrant against the green of the earth. Jack smiled softly, knowing that she had picked him for no other reason than the simple joy of it. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes about the changes she had brought to his life.
"You're up early," Ayanna said, her voice soft but full of warmth. There was no hint of the fear or sadness that had once filled her words.
Instead, there was an easy confidence in the way she spoke now. Jack shrugged, sitting down beside her on the porch. "Couldn't sleep," he said, though the truth was he was finding it harder and harder to lie to her. It wasn't just the nights that kept him awake anymore. It was the thought of her, of what they were becoming. Ayanna offered him the wildflowers, a small smile on her face. "For you," she said simply. Jack took the flowers from her, his fingers brushing against hers, and he could feel the warmth of her touch, the way it grounded him in a way nothing else had. Because of Shaq, he had spent so many years running from connection, from intimacy, but now, with Ayanna, he couldn't imagine being anywhere else.
"They're beautiful," Jack said, his voice quiet as he admired the flowers in his hands.
"Break. Just like you." Ayanna looked down, a soft blush creeping across her cheeks. She didn't respond right away, but Jack could see the happiness in her eyes. The past few weeks had been full of these quiet, simple moments. Moments that Jack had once thought he would never experience. And yet here they were, sitting together, sharing something real, something they both needed, but hadn't known how to ask for. The silence between them was comfortable now. There was no tension, no need to fill the space with words. They were just two people, living their lives in a way that made sense to them. For Jack, it was a new feeling, one he hadn't thought he would ever know. He had been so afraid of the pain that love could bring that he had shut himself off from everything. But now, sitting next to Ayanna, he realized that love wasn't something to run from. It was something to be nurtured, something that grew stronger the more you cared for it. As the sun set lower in the sky, casting a warm, golden light over the landscape, Jack felt a sense of peace settle over him. It was a feeling he had never expected to experience, and it was one that he knew would stay with him for the rest of his life. He reached over and took Ayanna's hand in his thumb gently brushing over the back of her fingers. She looked up at him, her gaze soft but steady. There was no need for words between them. They understood each other in a way that no one else could. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Jack said, his voice low and thoughtful. He wasn't just talking about the months that had passed since he found her in the snow. He was talking about the journey they had taken together, the way their lives had intertwined in ways neither of them had planned.
Ayanna nodded, her eyes reflecting the same understanding.
"We have," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But there's still more to go." Jack smiled at her words, squeezing her hand gently. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his words carrying the weight of the promise. Ayanna's smile widened, and for a moment Jack could see the hope in her eyes, the same hope that had brought her to him all those weeks ago. She wasn't the same girl he had found lying in the snow. She had healed, and in the process, she had healed him too. And now, together, they would face whatever came next. The night fell quietly around them, and Jack sat back, his eyes on the stars above. For the first time in years, he felt content. He had found something he hadn't even realized he was searching for. A future, a connection, and someone to share it with. And as Ayanna rested her head on his shoulder, Jack knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. The past was behind them now, and ahead of them lay a new beginning. A life built not on fear but on love.